On my far right, Matt Sinclair of the Taxpayers Alliance. Matt's been the director of the Taxpayers Alliance since November of last year, and in August of last year published his second book, Let Them Eat Carbon. I've already introduced Kwasi, the Conservative MP for Spelthorne. Kwasi is also a member of the Transport Select Committee. Sam Gyimah on my immediate left was elected Conservative MP for East Surrey in the last election and is a member of the International Development Select Committee. And on my far left, Andrew Sentance, Senior Economic Advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers and a former member, of course, of the Monetary Policy Committee. I'll take the panellists in order from my far right to my far left, and I've warned you already about what will happen after 3 or 4 minutes. Matt, please get us underway.
The critical thing about the energy sector is not to try and make it grow itself. You can make the energy sector grow, you can make its asset base large, you can try and push more people to work in the energy sector, and you'll do much wider economic harm because you remove that critical role the energy sector should be taking, which is supplying affordable, reliable energy to the rest of the economy, which is far more important. So the critical thing to understand about the role of growth in the energy sector itself is that it's not about the energy sector's growth, it's about the difference it makes to the ability of other sectors, particularly manufacturing, to grow. First I just want to say one quick thing about a broader step that will be needed in order to make any sort of sensible energy policy possible, which is to accept that the EU's renewable targets, the current British 2020 renewable target, doesn't make sense. It implies the biggest increase in Europe here, where there are particular geographical constraints. That's not a step for the budget, but it's important to understand because it is necessary at some point if any sort of sensible steps in the budget are to be sustainable in the long term. So 3 critical steps I think that could be you could start to take in the budget. First, stop picking losers. Stop giving the biggest subsidies to the worst and least efficient sources of energy. That means looking at feed-in tariffs, the cuts. I mean, it's led to legal action because it was handled very, very poorly. But it still leaves extremely generous subsidies to solar, which don't make sense. The renewable heat incentive. If you want to go further, include nuclear in the renewables obligation, which can allow the cost of that scheme to fall, and removes the need for another policy I'll discuss in a minute. And then scrap the banding of the renewables obligation, which is a system whereby the renewables obligation gives the most generous subsidies to the highest cost sources of energy. In theory, it's developing immature technologies and practice. It's nonsense. It's just picking the most expensive sources of power, giving them more money. These aren't newer sources of power, particularly. In fact, the newest one, nuclear, is probably the one which will get the lowest subsidy. So it's completely backwards to the actual logic of developing these things. Then look at specific measures which hit our competitiveness. The carbon floor price, which means pushing up our price of energy by pushing up our carbon floor price, and will depress the market floor price in the rest of Europe, and thereby lower everyone else's cost of energy. It's a direct trade of our competitiveness for theirs, and it deserves the title I gave it for industrial masochism. It's an incredible measure, and that should be abolished. What the government's done instead is they've looked at energy-intensive industries. The problem is, this logic of energy-intensive industries doesn't get at how the economy works. There are lots of businesses where it isn't a critical thing, where if their energy costs go up, they just go out of business or they move. Those are the energy-intensive industries. There are lots of businesses, this is just another cost, and quite a substantial one, and when it goes up, they're less able to invest, less able to grow here. Finally, and this is I think the critical long-term step to establishing an alternative climate policy which is much more productive in an environment post the collapse of Copenhagen a few years ago, with no treaty on the cards until 2020, no even prospect of an agreement until maybe 2014, 2015. And I think this is it. Repurpose a smaller green investment bank, cut the funding by 90%, it'll still be £300 million, give that funding to research and development rather than funding deployment now, and will do much more to help the international drive to reduce emissions.
Matt, thank you. Kwasi.
Thank you very much. A very simple message relating to transport and the economy. I think that we should liberalise transport markets, and I'll explain that in a few words now. I think if you look at the development of transport policy, it was completely dominated by our experience in World War II, where you had a massive command economy and where people like Tony Benn would say, we plan to win the war, so we should plan to win the peace. So very much that culture of state planning. And if you look at certain examples of this, we could look at compensation schemes. I mean, near my constituency, there was obviously this big issue of the third runway. And the problem with that debate was that the BAA, the people who wanted to build the third runway, were not actually allowed or able to compensate residents in a way that reflected market reality. I think if you add this element of compensation, I think that you would, in a sense, mitigate a lot of the hostility towards projects like this, because in effect some people say it's bribing, or you're paying money in order to get over the initial objection. And one example of this, I was talking to a French politician, and he was saying that essentially they just bribe people. And if they build a nuclear power station, they will give you free energy for life if you live within a mile or 2 miles of the actual station. And surprised to say, actually that's quite effective. People respond to that. Another issue where we could actually liberalise is roads. I think there should be some element of road pricing. And of course, for political reasons, that's not a road that is particularly popular. But if we did it in a piecemeal fashion, I mean, already the M6 has a toll road. And I think we looked at a scheme where we could put toll roads on the 5 busiest, the 5 most commonly used motorways. And we could raise about £1 billion, 1.1 billion actually. And we could use that figure actually to reduce petrol duty. So in a way, you're taxing people on their behaviour, on consumption, on the choices that they make, and you're trying to rationalise that, as opposed to just making motorways completely free so that people use them the whole time, and then having very, very high petrol duty. Another aspect, I think, where liberalisation would help is Network Rail. I think that is a behemoth. It's completely unwieldy. It's a completely illogical structure. And if you look at the assets, which we have done, the assets, I think, are about 20 billion, and they get miserable returns from these assets. And I think you would get, again, you would liberalise. By liberalisation, you would free a lot of that capital. You could split up the network, and you could sell off the assets, and or allow the THCs to operate them. And that would be much more effective a way of actually sweating, using these assets and getting value. So I think across a range of issues, in aviation, particularly on the roads, and also in rail, I think greater liberalisation will actually produce better results, which will be conducive to growth. And I think that this is something that will be looked at, I'm sure, in the next 5 or 10 years.
Kwasi, thank you very much for sticking to time. Sam.
Thank you very much. And 3 minutes to 3 points. Firstly, on infrastructure and why it's important as far as growth is concerned. Secondly, the problems that we have with infrastructure investment in the UK. And thirdly, some solutions. Now, the reason why infrastructure is important is, I think it's one of the areas where, if the government was to get its act right, we would actually see a jump-starting in growth. The CBI, for example, reckons that on infrastructure investment, you get 3 times as much bang for your buck. So that's just simply put one reason why I want this to see this as a focus in the main next budget. In China, what they did in the wake of the financial crisis is they pulled forward a lot of infrastructure investment. The China Investment Corporation will tell you that their GDP, they had a GDP uplift from 6.8% to 10% as a result of that GDP spend. So there again, you see that that's why infrastructure is absolutely important if we're going to create jobs and also growth. It's therefore not surprising that it's something that I would say, broadly speaking, the 2 main parties agree on. You know, the Liberal Democrats have talked about, Labour have talked about infrastructure spend, and the coalition instead of the Conservatives are talking about infrastructure spend. But that's where the agreement ends. Because what I see as the way forward is not to use the Brownite approach, which is PFI off-balance sheet schemes, as a way of financing our infrastructure. That has comprehensively failed. And the reason why it's failed is there are 2 problems with it. Firstly, the cost of capital is around 8%, whereas the cost of long-term UK gilts is about 3.2%. And secondly, one thing we found, and Jesse Norman, a colleague of mine, has run a campaign on this, the expenditure on our infrastructure was 60% higher than in Germany when we went down the Brownite approach. So, and the third problem around that is we've got no money. So how do we get the 200 billion we need to finance the infrastructure upgrade in the UK by 2015? And which brings me on to some solutions. And I think the way to look at this is to look at where the money actually is. And the money for infrastructure investment exists in, I think, three main places. Firstly, a lot of corporates out there are sitting on huge piles of cash, which they're willing to invest. And what I would like to see there is for the government to look at expanding the capital allowances scheme that get companies investing in machinery, in plant, etc., which should help drive up some of the infrastructure upgrades that we need. The second is our pension funds. Our pension funds are sitting in the UK on 800 billion of assets. But actually infrastructure in the UK is something that you don't focus on. If you look at Australia, if you look at Canada, if you look at Holland, their pension funds are big players in the infrastructure space. Now, it's particularly suitable infrastructure investment for pension funds because of the long-term nature of their liabilities, and infrastructure investment, if done rightly, brings stable long-term returns. So we need to look at a way, and I know the Treasury has started looking at it, the Chancellor mentioned it in the autumn statement, but what we need to see is we need to see more flesh on the bone as far as how we get our pension funds investing in UK infrastructure to drive our growth. The third pool of capital is sovereign wealth funds. Now, what we know is that a lot of sovereign wealth, when we talk about emerging markets, we always look at them as destinations of export-led growth. But actually, a lot of them, and specifically in China, are willing and looking at investing in places like the UK. A month ago, we had the China Investment Corporation investing 9% in Thames Water, and they're looking at a lot of assets in the UK. But the nature of the assets they're looking at in the UK is different to what they're looking at in other parts of the world. In China, in Africa, it's all about getting commodities and access to resources, etc. In the UK, it's about stable returns, and that is where our deficit reduction program, which is it's guaranteed our credit rating, is important. You know, our AAA credit rating. But we need to find a more constructive way of getting sovereign wealth funds involved in UK infrastructure investment. Now, we need to show that firstly we're open for business as a country, and I think what we need to do is we need to have the vehicles set up, but not the sort of vehicles that the Treasury created in the new Labour years that were overcomplicated, that ended up costing us a lot of money and actually didn't really deliver what we need. So that's what we need to do, create the right incentive structure, the right commercial vehicles for sovereign wealth funds, for pension funds, but also to allow all those companies that are sitting on piles of cash to invest in UK infrastructure. And that is what I call smart investing. We get what we need, we drive growth without the government using its balance sheet.
Sam, thank you. Andrew.
Thanks very much. I'm very much in favour of a supply-side approach to stimulating growth. Having sat on the Monetary Policy Committee and pulled the levers of monetary policy quite aggressively in the financial crisis, I think we've probably taken that as far as we can go. And we now need to much more focus back on supply-side measures. And there are four principles that I would encourage the government to be, or four main themes to have underpinning its supply-side strategy. There are a lot of measures and initiatives in the government's existing plan for growth, but they need to be better organised in a coherent framework. The four principles, I think, are first of all reducing regulation and minimising the burden of regulation. Secondly, a comprehensive programme of tax reform. Thirdly, measures to make the labour market more flexible and to address targeted problems such as youth unemployment. And fourthly, focusing government spending on key areas of value for business and wealth creation, particularly infrastructure, education and research. Now, let me just say a couple of words on regulation and then on tax reform. On regulation, obviously one of the big ticket items is employment regulation, which was accumulated over the period when the economy was growing well. I think the minimum wage, for example, was pushed up by about 70%, which is much more than inflation, since it was introduced. But perhaps more relevant to this panel is the planning system and the way that operates. The last government talked a lot about planning and reforming the planning system. And what I perceive from the business community is it's quite hard to see how that's being made concrete at the grassroots level, even though the current government is committed to making the planning system more effective. And I would propose a simple measure whereby local authorities are obliged to fast track any planning proposals that have an employment benefit in the local community. Maybe that could be enforced with some financial incentives for local authorities to do that. So I think making reform of the planning system and speedier planning more real is one proposal I think that needs to be pushed. The second area I mentioned was tax reform, and the government has a tax reform agenda for the corporate tax approach. But taxation is more than just corporate tax. Personal tax, expenditure taxes, and environmental taxes are all in need of having a much clearer medium-term framework. There's limited room for manoeuvre in the short term, but I would encourage the government actually to think of green papers on those three areas: personal tax, expenditure taxes, and environmental taxes. And on environmental taxation, really we face a very uneven situation in terms of motor fuel is taxed at about £250 per tonne of CO2, whereas domestic gas consumption attracts a low rate of VAT. Now there's a big political minefield when you start talking about the way the VAT system operates, but it's very hard to see in the current framework of environmental taxation incentives much principle, and I think a reference carbon price should be established to guide environmental taxation, and taxes should not move away from that in the opposite direction to that reference carbon price. The other point I would mention on environmental taxation is to Kwasi on taxing congestion. We don't really have any price mechanisms that address congestion directly. And we've talked about road pricing a lot. It seems to be stuck in some sort of technological problem that you can't get the technology to work. So some simple permitting scheme, such as a tolling scheme that Kwasi is suggesting, may be the first step towards road pricing.
Andrew, thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists for sticking to time. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes for questions, if there are any at all from the audience, or for comments. And if you can say loudly and clearly who you are, if I select you for a question, that would be of great use to everybody else in the room. So I can see two here. I'll take Richard, and then gentleman behind Richard.
Richard VP. On the energy sector, the crisis we face, of course, is an energy gap, and just not being able to keep the lights on if they're not careful. On the subsidies to wind and all the rest, well, I have a vested interest in that, but agree with all the objections to it. But one sort of issue of warning, and I think Andrew Sentance is right in talking about the carbon price. The point about a carbon price or a carbon floor and a carbon tax is that it is the free market way of addressing climate change if you want to address climate change. All the renewables, the subsidies and all the rest is a very dirigi's picking winners. If you believe there's a problem with climate change, then a floor price of carbon or a price of carbon makes sense. So be aware that if you're going to get into that area, I don't quite see how you can challenge the need for any environmental taxes or the need for a carbon floor tax unless you're prepared to grasp the nettle and say that you don't think climate change is an issue that needs to be dealt with.
Matt Sinclair, you're a denier.
The carbon floor price in particular is arithmetically a reduction in carbon price to the extent it reduces carbon, increases carbon prices here, reduces them elsewhere in Europe. Regardless of your views on climate change, is utterly ineffective in terms of addressing emissions. More broadly, let's say that the carbon price approach works if you're trying to fine-tune these technologies into action at the point they're almost ready to deploy, and you can do it globally, efficiently, neutrally. Now, it's all very well saying, well, we should have a global, efficient, neutral carbon price, but if we had a global government able to do that kind of thing, it would do all kinds of other horrible things which would make it more worth it. I think the free market approach, which fits best with the current and well-established role of government is to focus on basic research such that you get better options. If you need support for deployment at a later stage when these technologies are closer to being economic, do that. I don't think a carbon price is one of those ideas that works on an economist's blackboard and makes a transition very, very poorly. It's a practical policy with a global problem. So I don't think that particularly, and I think Andrew's put in a reference price, we've had one. We had the shadow price, which DEFRA produced. That was then junked because it wasn't high enough. So they then came up with this approach which basically says, we're going to assume the targets are fixed, and the right carbon price is whatever carbon price you need to get to that target, which is a kind of reverse engineering which can produce wildly overly expensive policies. So yeah, I don't think carbon prices are the way forward in realistic or proper policies.
Yeah, William Davis from Portcullis Public Affairs. Kwasi Kwarteng spoke about liberalisation of transport infrastructure. And I was just wondering if you think that logic could be applied to the London taxi infrastructure, where you have the turning circle rule, which essentially stifles all innovation that could, or much innovation that could lead to greener taxis and cheaper taxis. And I was wondering if you think that actually we should be liberalising that market as well as the one you spoke about.
I think you've got a very good point about the liberalisation of taxis. I mean, I have taken evidence on the Transport Select Committee from regional taxi operators, and you would not believe the number. I mean, every borough has their own jurisdiction, and I mean, I can say this now. I couldn't say this on the committee, but it is a sort of medieval system in terms of every little principality having their own rules about who can operate taxis. And what the consumer wants is just a taxi that's going to take him or her from A to B relatively safely. And the situation that we have generally in the country is one in which, you know, if you're in Spelthorne Borough Council, you have a Spelthorne Borough Council permit. If you're in Elmbridge, across the river, you have an Elmbridge permit. And there are very distinct rules about how you can operate. And I think we've got to look at this entirely. And I know this isn't specifically with regard to London, but I think this is an area, certainly with taxis, that we could have a lot more liberalisation.
I'll take one final question from the back, Richard.
Richard Wellings, IEA. This could be for either Kwasi or Sam, but if we're going to have efficient investment in transport, it's very important to have a level playing field. So I'd like to ask either of you, what therefore are the implications for rail subsidies? How do you see rail subsidies developing over the next couple of decades?
Okay.
Yeah, right. You want to pass the baton.
I think clearly with rail we have a serious problem, because the rail, as far as I can see, the railway industry has been subsidised for the last 100 years. I mean, the days when you had private people and there was no government capital were a very, very long time ago. So there will always be an element of subsidy, and how we manage that is what the question is. And I think certainly in Britain, for various reasons, we've got high levels of unionisation. The rail costs are very high. But if you're asking me whether we're going to ever move to a free market rail system, I'll have to say that's very unlikely. So you're always going to have elements of subsidy. Now, once you accept that, then we have to work out how best to actually organise these assets. And I suggested in my initial presentation that we could do more, I think, to liberalise network rail, to make these assets work for us better. But I don't think you're ever going to move to a situation where you will have a free market in rail. Does that answer your question?
Yes, slightly disappointed, thanks.
Well, we have overrun a bit, so I want to thank all 4 of our panellists for a range of punctual and reflective views. Thank you very much indeed.